Hi, welcome to this talk about the puzzle of the shroud and about how it's been solved and how you can be sure this man is Jesus. This talk is far from what I had in mind when I started researching the shroud 7 years ago. I walked into a Catholic bookshop and saw a poster of this face on the wall, and I was amazed. Surely, I thought, no one believes in that anymore. It was carbon dated. It's from the Middle Ages. So I decided I should write something explaining why the shroud was a fake. But I quickly realised that, like most people, I knew nothing about carbon dating. 7 years later, I know a lot about carbon dating and about the shroud, and I've written 3 books explaining why it's not a fake. My aim is to make the truth about the most researched artefact in history understandable for ordinary people. That's a challenge, given the evidence about the shroud is vast. Shroud expert Father Andrew Dalton has described it as a universe of information. But it helps to understand that the shroud is a puzzle, and therefore it fits together in only one way. When you understand the puzzle pieces, it's not difficult. I'm not usually all that interested in puzzles for their own sake, but this puzzle is the most important and profound puzzle I've come across. My first book, Riddles of the Shroud, Questions Science Can't Answer, presented 99 pieces of evidence indicating the shroud is genuine. None of that evidence has been successfully challenged. I'm sure you'll all be relieved that I'm not going to take you through all 99 pieces of evidence. My second book, The Shroud Rises as the Carbon Date is Buried, went more deeply into the 1988 carbon dating. You might know that the facts about the carbon dating took a long time to come out. The carbon daters kept the raw data locked away for 28 years. A legal challenge under Britain's Freedom of Information laws finally forced the carbon daters to hand over the data. Since then, it's become clear the medieval carbon date was definitely wrong. The final book in the trilogy is The Shroud Puzzle Solved, How You Can Be Sure It Is Jesus. This book seeks to bring together the most compelling evidence about the shroud. It seems to me the evidence is so strong that the conclusion that the shroud is genuine is inescapable. New evidence is always welcome, but I believe we already have more than enough evidence to support the shroud's authenticity. In fact, you could argue that in some respects we have too much evidence. Where the shroud is concerned, less can be more. This is because trying to take it all in can be confusing for some people. They can end up thinking that you need to understand it all. So this can be one of the great challenges with the shroud, making it easy for everyone to understand. I'll start with a story about the first talk I gave about riddles of the shroud. I was asked to speak at a seminar for priests who aren't normally known to be aggressive debaters, so I expected a pretty tame event. But when I arrived at the seminar, I found that someone who was then known as one of the most outspoken clerics in the Catholic Church, Cardinal George Pell, was there, and that he wasn't on side with my views on the shroud. He came over and chatted, but as he took his leave, he pointed towards the room where I was to speak and said pointedly, "I'll see you in there." I was taken aback. It was like being called to the principal's office. As the cardinal walked away, a priest standing next to me leant in and explained, "He's been telling us that the carbon date proved the shroud was a fake." Anyone who knew Cardinal Pell would know he definitely wasn't shy about expressing his views. That was a great thing when you were on his side. Some of you may have seen his famous debate with Richard Dawkins that millions of people have now watched on YouTube. Cardinal Pell didn't give an inch. The highlight of the debate came when Dawkins insisted that the universe could have come from nothing. At that point, the audience broke into laughter. Dawkins got upset and burst out with, "Why is that funny?" Cardinal Pell spoke for the audience. "Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing." Again, the audience roared with laughter. To this day, it was one of the great moments in the God versus nothing debate. So I was well aware that Cardinal Pell was someone who could reduce intellectual opponents to a laughingstock. To be frank, I was tempted to beat a hasty retreat. When I entered the lecture room, I noticed the Cardinal at the front of the queue purchasing a copy of the book. During my talk, he kept flipping through the pages and checking out everything I was saying. It was a bit unnerving. Then came the Q&A. There were plenty of questions, but none from His Eminence. When it was all over, I felt relieved, but then I spotted the towering figure of the Cardinal making a straight line for me. I thought, heck, he's going to take me down in person. But to my surprise, he humbly held out his hand, shook mine, thanking me for restoring his faith in the shroud. As they say, you could have knocked me down with a feather. Of course, I knew it wasn't my speaking skills that had restored Cardinal Pell's faith in the shroud. The evidence spoke for itself, so the encounter boosted my confidence in the evidence. Some people ignore the evidence because they still think that the carbon date proved the shroud is a medieval forgery. The main reason for that is they think the carbon dating of 1988 was totally scientific and final. But that's simply not true. For a start, the carbon daters ignored the ground rules, the scientific protocols that were established by an international panel of experts to ensure the dating process was reliable. Then, after the carbon daters came up with their date, unknown individuals leaked the results to the media. So a rushed media conference was organised before any data was published. This image shows the three carbon daters who announced the carbon date in London. The only written evidence that appears to have been presented at the conference was the date range 1260 to 1390 chalked onto an old blackboard. The one who did most of the talking was the man on the left with his arms folded, Professor Teddy Hall. According to Professor Hall, an atheist, someone just got a bit of linen, faked it up and flogged it. This claim was ridiculous for anyone who knew about the scientific evidence gathered over decades by some of the world's leading scientists. Apart from the absurd carbon date, Hall had no evidence at all to support his claim. The man in the middle was Dr. Michael Tite, who was appointed by the British Museum to oversee the carbon dating. At the time, he didn't challenge Hall's claims, but in 2016, Tite admitted in a BBC interview that a forger could not have faked up the shroud. He indicated that he believed that the burial cloth had been wrapped around a real dead body. Tite went on to suggest that it could have been the body of a medieval crusader who could have been captured and crucified by Muslim fighters. But there's no evidence to support this claim, and no Muslim troops could have created the shroud that still cannot be replicated or explained by scientists. One of the speakers at this conference, film director David Rolfe, who directed the award-winning documentary on the shroud, The Silent Witness, has offered $1 million reward to any researcher who can explain how a medieval forger could have created the shroud. After several years, no one has come forward to claim the prize. If you're wondering how the carbon dating went wrong, I'll explain briefly. When the first data from the carbon dating was published in Nature Journal in 1989, the carbon daters claimed that a key number, known to statisticians as the significance level, was 5%. This was the lowest level that could have had any credibility at all. Notice the significance level for all the control samples to the right are much higher. For instance, the one next to the Shroud sample was 90%. But when the raw data was finally released in 2017, many experts found that the real significance level for the Shroud, based on the carbon dator's own data, wasn't even 5%, but was as low as 1%. That is, there was only one chance in 100 that the carbon date was reliable. Whether the carbon dators were aware of it or not, the date they gave the world was flawed. The reason why the significance level was so low is that even though the three carbon dating labs, Oxford, Zurich and Arizona, used Shroud samples from the same tiny sample of cloth, their results were 130 years apart. That is, the carbon date for the tiny 3 centimetre piece of cloth moving from the bottom of the Shroud towards the body rose by 130 years. As this graph indicates, the date actually rose in a linear or systematic pattern. This rate of increase would push the carbon date into the future. The only explanation is evidence that the Shroud image was caused by radiation, which in turn was capable of causing a neutron flux, raising carbon-14 levels on the linen cloth in a linear way. This theory has been backed by many physicists and by nuclear engineer Robert Rucker. Rucker has carried out precise calculations to support this theory. It is also supported by experiments by a leading physicist, Dr. Paolo di Lazzaro, that confirm the Shroud image can be explained by a massive burst of light/radiation. Remember that name, Dr. Paolo di Lazzaro. We'll look at his groundbreaking research shortly. Because of the failure of the 1988 carbon dating, some Shroud researchers have called for a new carbon dating, but that's unlikely to happen because carbon dating has a well-known flaw. It has often been wrong, sometimes by thousands of years, due to carbon-14 contamination, and the Shroud is highly likely to be contaminated. Putting aside the evidence for neutron flux, one possible cause, argued by prominent Shroud researcher Joseph G. Marino, is that invisible mending was used to repair damage to the Shroud in the area from which the carbon dating sample was taken. In the meantime, there is an absolute mountain of evidence indicating the Shroud is 2,000 years old, the actual burial cloth of Jesus. So let's look at some of that evidence. First, the Gospels state that 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, the body of Jesus was laid in a fine linen cloth. The Shroud indicates that blood from over 300 wounds was transferred onto the cloth first, before the image. We know this because scientists have found there's no image under the blood. So a massive network of blood flows and clots was transferred to the cloth. That would have caused the cloth to bond with the body. In other words, it would have stuck fast, glued on by the blood. Then, mysteriously, an impossible image formed on the cloth, and the body vanished, leaving all the blood deposits intact. And so we have an intriguing puzzle, one that has helped to make the Shroud the most researched artifact in history. We'll start with the primary puzzle. It raises three questions. 1. How did the blood get on the cloth first, that is, before the image? No artist would ever work this way. Obviously, all artists would start with the image, then add the blood. The second question is, how did the image get onto the cloth? No artist could create the image of a body with perfect anatomy unknown in the Middle Ages, matching the position of all the blood flows and blood clots, and in particular fitting it to over 300 blood clots that were already on the cloth. And finally, how could the body, which would have been stuck to the cloth by the blood, escape without breaking up the blood clots? To make sense of this primary puzzle, it helps to know 9 key puzzle pieces. They're not complicated, but the message they convey is powerful. These puzzle pieces confirm that the shroud is genuine, and some provide evidence that helps to solve the primary puzzle as well. The puzzle of the shroud goes back to the first Easter Sunday morning, when the apostles Peter and John raced to the tomb after they were told it was empty. According to the Gospel of John, Peter entered first and saw the empty linen cloths. Then John entered. His Gospel states, he saw and he believed. If what he saw was the shroud we have today, he'd have had good reason to conclude that Jesus had risen. This is the shroud as it is displayed in exhibitions. The dark diamond shapes are burned from a fire in 1532. The faint images behind them are images of a man, front and back, covered in blood. This is how the shroud looks with the front and back images arranged vertically. The image is so faint it is barely visible. It has no artist materials, no paint, pigment, ink or dye that could explain the image. Instead, scientists have found the image is made from discoloured microscopic linen fibres that act like pixels on a computer screen or printout, creating an image journalists would describe as a half-tone image. They've been used by newspapers and magazines since they were developed in the 1880s. There was certainly nothing like them in the Middle Ages, and certainly not made by discoloured linen microfibres. To the naked eye, the image on the cloth is faint and blurry, but when the first photo was taken in 1898 by an amateur photographer, Secondo Pia, and the negative was developed, the image was instantly recognised as a high-resolution photographic positive. This meant the original image had been both photographic and a negative all along, for hundreds of years before photography was created, in a drawn-out process in the 19th century. Like so many facts about the shroud, the high-resolution photographic image was impossible, but there it was staring everyone in the face. The photographic image caused debate around the world. Shroud skeptics insisted it had to be a fake, that amateur photographer Secondo Pia had faked it up. Pia was so upset he said he wished he'd never taken the photo, and the shroud was returned to its casket. 33 years passed before another photo was taken. This time it was done by a leading European photographer, Giuseppe Henri, in front of witnesses. Much to the disappointment of skeptics, this time the details of the man on the shroud were even clearer. Skeptics simply insisted science would work it out. One day. A century later, we're still waiting. Look closely at Henri's photo of the face. The features are astonishingly clear and detailed. So detailed you can see the eye line on the right is clear and straight, but the eye line on the left is broken. This, according to forensic scientists, is because there's a huge swelling pushing up against the left eye. They say that if the man on the cloth had been alive, he couldn't have opened the eye. They also point to swellings on the bridge of the nose and on the right cheek. This sort of detail is something that no forger, even the very best medieval artists, could have created. Then, in the 1970s, another inexplicable feature of the shroud image was discovered. The shroud image had computer-readable 3D qualities. This fact was uncovered by engineer Peter Schumacher. He scanned the shroud into an early analog computer known as the VP8 image analyzer. Schumacher explained in an interview, "The shroud is a unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. Nothing else like it. three-dimensional relief of the front and the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other, nowhere, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. I never heard of any way to make it. Just the Shroud of Turin. The 3D qualities of the shroud have since been confirmed by digital images and have been used to create 3D sculptures of the body, which has been shown to be in a state of rigor mortis. Note, the upper body is bent forward and the legs are bent at the knees, frozen in the positions they had on the cross. The rigor mortis in the arms has been broken so that the body could be buried. All this evidence from the impossible image makes up the first piece of the Shroud Puzzle. So now we can speed things up. Another early discovery was that the blood and anatomy on the shroud are 100% perfect. This has been confirmed by many prominent forensic scientists, beginning in 1899 with Professor Yves Delage, a professor of comparative anatomy at the Sorbonne. Delage, an agnostic, was fascinated by what he saw on the shroud and carried out a thorough study. His findings set off a firestorm of protest from his atheist and agnostic colleagues, but countless experts have since confirmed his conclusions were correct. One of the best known was Dr. Pierre Barbet, the well-known author of A Doctor at Calvary. He spent most of his life working with blood, beginning with his work as a medic in the First World War, then later as a leading surgeon in Paris. He carried out experiments that confirmed the accuracy of the blood and the anatomy. Barbet also identified the primary puzzle of the shroud. He wrote, "Nothing will explain to us how the body left the cloth while leaving on the shroud a fine and unblemished impression of the body and the marks of its bleeding. A man would not be able to remove the body of another without destroying the blood clots." This, of course, confirms a key piece of the puzzle. Barbet summed up that all the bloodstains on the shroud came from fresh clots, or clots softened by, quote, "the steam which normally issues from a corpse for a fairly long time." He concluded, "These portraits of clots have about them a natural, indeed most striking effect of genuineness, down to the smallest details. Only nature could have produced them, forming them on the skin. They are perfect reproductions of natural clots. No artist would even have been able to imagine them in all their minute details, and an artist would have drawn back before the insurmountable difficulties of executing them." Another prominent 20th century forensic doctor was Dr. Robert Buckland, who inspired the TV series Quincy, MD. He detailed his findings in the documentary The Silent Witness. He said that examining the shroud was like examining a real body. So the perfect blood deposits and anatomy form the second puzzle piece. Then, in the 1970s, chemists dug deeper. Jewish chemist Dr. Alan Adler confirmed the blood on the shroud was genuine. He stated the blood marks on the Shroud of Turin result from a transfer to the cloth affected by its direct contact with the exudates of clotted blood from the wounds of a man who suffered a traumatic death in accord with that historically described for the death of Christ. Adler also found the shroud had high levels of the blood chemical bilirubin, consistent with someone who was tortured. This evidence raises the question, did some medieval forger really scourge and crucify an innocent man just to make a fake relic? At that time, the punishment for murder was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Recent studies have also uncovered high levels of two other blood chemicals that confirm torture, creatinine and fibrin. The findings came from leading shroud researcher Professor Giulio Fanti, who outlined the evidence in the second edition of his book, the Shroud of Turin, 1st century after Christ. The chemical evidence of torture is the third puzzle piece. Then came evidence that the shroud offered previously unknown details of 1st century Roman crucifixion, details that could only be known to an eyewitness. Here we see the front of the body showing the chest wound. It matches the exact shape of a Roman spear called the lancia or lancia, and the scourge marks all over the chest match wounds from the Roman scourge known as the flagrum, discovered by modern archaeologists. As you can see, the flagrum had dumbbell-shaped pieces of metal or bone at the end of its lashes. They caused the most distinctive wounds, but archaeologists have also identified scourge wounds from two other Roman scourges, the Spanish cords and the virgi. Another revelation that was uncovered by the shroud was that the nails through the hands passed through the wrists, not through the palms of the hands, as artists had always thought. Research has shown that nails through the palms could not support the weight of a body. These and other examples of eyewitness details form the fourth puzzle piece. Then came more compelling microscopic evidence. Traces of soil were found on the surface of the cloth and under the blood. It was first discovered on the soles of the feet, then on the left knee and on the nose. This soil matched Jerusalem's rare limestone soil, known as travertine aragonite soil. This fact was confirmed by some of the world's leading experts in crystallography. The evidence reveals that Jesus fell not only to his knees, but on his face as well. In addition to the Jerusalem soil, microscopic deposits of Jerusalem flower pollens were also discovered on the cloth. They were pollens from plants that bloom in Jerusalem in spring, at the time the crucifixion took place. The pollen was identified by a pioneer in pollen study, criminologist Dr. Max Frey. Dr. Frey also found pollens confirming a journey from the south of Eastern Europe to the north and then across to Western Europe. This journey fits other evidence of the shroud's history. Dr. Frey's pollen evidence has been confirmed by several pollen experts, including two Jewish scientists from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The microscopic soil and pollen evidence forms the fifth puzzle piece. Now, very quickly, we'll take a look at the evidence of the shroud's early history in Eastern Europe, illustrated by images matching the face on the shroud, found on many icons and coins from the first millennium. This icon is the oldest known example, dated to the 550s. Overlay studies show the facial structure is a close match to the face on the shroud. It confirms that the face on the shroud is the face of Jesus that became known as the image of Edessa. Evidence suggests the shroud was folded and placed in a frame with only the face showing, because in those days burial cloths were believed to be unclean. The image of Edessa then went on to become a model for many other icons and coins, and was eventually transferred to Constantinople in 944 AD, where it was discovered that when the cloth was opened, there was a whole body there. One of the best known coins is the Justinian II golden solidus from 692. It clearly matches the image on the shroud. Note the huge eyeballs that the creator of the coin has used to fill the large empty eye sockets seen on the shroud image. Other facial features include the beard and hair that also match the shroud image. Another famous historical image clearly linked to the shroud is the Prey Codex, dated to the 1190s. It has many features in common with the shroud. Notice Jesus is naked, something that was taboo in the Middle Ages. The arms are crossed at the wrists, and the burial cloth has a herringbone pattern that the artist has enlarged, making sure it can't be missed. This close-up also shows 4 small circles in an L shape that match well-known L-shaped burn holes on the shroud. The photographic history of the shroud is the 6th puzzle piece, only 3 to go. One of the most impressive pieces of evidence is the Sudarium of Oviedo. It is from the earliest centuries of Christianity and was traditionally believed to be the face cloth that covered Jesus' face from Golgotha to the garden tomb. It's been in the Spanish city of Oviedo for over 13 centuries and has never crossed paths with the shroud. Nevertheless, it has extensive blood flows that match the blood flows on the shroud, as well as microscopic traces of Jerusalem soil and flower pollens. What are the odds? The Sudarium is the 7th puzzle piece. And now 2 discoveries that only come to light over the past decade. First, several new dating tests of shroud samples point to a 1st century date, something that was already confirmed by the primitive nature of the cloth. The best known dating test is the wax-S dating, wide-angle X-ray scattering. It was developed by a research team led by one of Italy's leading scientific researchers, Dr. Liberato De Caro, a member of Italy's National Research Council. His team dated the shroud to the 1st century, but it took 3 years for the media to publish the story. Finally, last year, the media realised how important the finding was, and the wax-S dating is now known around the world, sparking new interest in the shroud. The new dating evidence forms the 8th puzzle piece. Finally, what appears to be the most compelling finding of all, evidence showing that the shroud image can be explained by a massive burst of light beyond anything we can produce even today. This discovery was made by a team of scientists led by another of Italy's leading researchers, Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro. The scientists used intensive bursts of UV light from an eczema laser to discolour linen cloth in a way that matches all the microscopic details of the image on the shroud. Not only did the results match the colour of the shroud image, they also matched its astonishing superficial depth, a fraction of the width of a human hair. To be precise, the depth of the shroud image is 0.2 microns. If you're not familiar with microns, think of a millimetre, then divide it 1,000 times. That will get you 1 micron. Then divide the micron another 5 times. Don't bother trying to imagine it. It's not possible. But there's even more. Something that is even more astonishing. The discoloration on the linen cloth also matched the molecular structure of the discoloration on the shroud. Sorry to get technical, but the molecular structure matched the shroud's pattern of double carbon bonds and double carbon oxygen bonds interspersed with molecules with single bonds. That was amazing enough. But then on top of all of this, Dr. Di Lazzaro calculated that to produce enough light to create the whole shroud image would require 34 trillion watts of light energy, more than we could generate today. The main point of this research is that after 127 years of scientific research, the only thing that has been able to reproduce the microscopic detail of the shroud image is a massive burst of light. Keep in mind that the shroud image is photographic, something that will require light, and it is 3D, revealing the distance between the cloth and the body, another thing that also points to light. So the only evidence that can explain the image on the shroud is an impossible burst of light. This completes the 9 puzzle pieces. Before we continue, a quick recap of the puzzle pieces. 1. We started with an impossible photographic 3D image. 2. Then came the perfect blood and anatomy. 3. Then the blood chemicals confirming the man on the shroud was tortured. 4. Then the eyewitness details of the crucifixion, the Roman lancia, the 3 scourges, and the nails through the wrists. 5. Microscopic traces of Jerusalem soil and flower pollen. 6. The historical evidence, icons, coins, and the Prayer Codex, all matching the face on the shroud. 7. The Sudarium of Oviedo, with matching blood patterns, blood chemicals, soil, and pollen. 8. The new dating tests pointing to the 1st century. And finally, UV light experiments that match the shroud image's colour, incredibly superficial depth, and its molecular structure. If all this evidence taken together is not convincing, it's hard to imagine what would be. So there they are, 9 compelling puzzle pieces indicating the shroud is genuine. Of course, it's not necessary to know all 9. Even the individual puzzle pieces can be compelling. Each one has convinced experts in each field of study. Many scientists were sure after the photographic 3D image was revealed. Pathologists were persuaded by the blood and anatomy. Chemists were convinced by the chemistry that confirms torture. Archaeologists by the eyewitness details. Others by the Jerusalem pollen and soil. Historians by the icons and coins. Some by the Sudarium of Oviedo. Others by the new dating tests. And finally, the most compelling evidence of all, the light evidence. After more than a century of scientific research, the only evidence that can explain the impossible image. But do they pass the miracle test? The final puzzle piece indicates that the image was caused by light. But something physicists agree about is that you don't get light from a body. The evidence indicating the image is photographic confirms that light had to be involved. The evidence that the image has 3D qualities also points to light. And one more thing does as well. Remember this? The graph from the carbon dating, the one that showed the carbon-14 levels rising relentlessly, moving along the linen cloth towards the body. Ever since the carbon date was announced, nuclear physicists have been pointing out that a burst of light/radiation could explain the linear increase in the carbon date by causing a neutron flux. They point out that the trend of increasing dates from the carbon dating would have taken the carbon date well into the future. Nuclear engineer Robert Rucker has been precise. He has calculated that the carbon dating evidence suggests the carbon date would have reached 4,000 years into the future. So the UV light experiments are supported by 3 pieces of evidence. The evidence of the photographic image, the evidence of the 3D image, and the raw data from the carbon dating. If all this evidence taken together is not convincing, it's hard to imagine what would be. So, with all of the evidence pointing to the shroud's authenticity, we'll return to the 3 questions posed by the primary puzzle. The first question was, how did the blood get on the cloth before the image? The answer is that no artist could have done it. A real body had to be placed in the cloth. This allowed the blood to be transferred to the exact places it needed to be to match the image of the body. 2. How did the image get onto the cloth? After 127 years of research, the only experimental evidence that can explain it is evidence that points to an incredible burst of light. Finally, how did the body escape the cloth without damaging the blood? The body, which was glued to the cloth by the blood, needed to transition into something non-material. The only conceivable way that could remove the body from the cloth without disturbing the blood deposits. Once again, the evidence we now have points to a process involving radiant energy/light. But is this really credible? Could a body really dematerialize in a burst of light? Science has an answer. Physicists have now turned matter into light and light into matter. If scientists can do it, God certainly could. Even before the resurrection, witnesses saw it happen to Jesus on Mount Tabor. As the Gospel of Matthew puts it, he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became white as light. Given all the evidence about what we see on the shroud, this description offers a foretaste of what caused the photographic 3D image on the cloth. And after the resurrection, witnesses reported that Jesus repeatedly appeared and disappeared to disciples on the road to Emmaus, to the apostles in a locked room, and again to doubting Thomas, and later, according to St. Paul, to 500 disciples at one time. Of course, this evidence does not come from scientific facts, but countless witnesses of the resurrection went to their deaths insisting it was all true. When you think about it, this evidence is the most compelling of all. Anyone who is convinced that the shroud is Jesus' burial cloth is in good company. In addition to all the scientists and other academics who now believe the shroud is genuine, many non-Catholic Christian scholars have stated they believe the shroud is genuine. And the past 3 popes have demonstrated that they agree. During a pilgrimage in 1998, Pope John Paul II described the shroud as a mirror of the gospel. He said, "I wish to thank the Lord for this unique gift, which asks for the believer's loving attention and complete willingness to follow the Lord." This was a powerful endorsement. No pope would ever thank God for a fake. He wouldn't describe a forgery as a unique gift from God and state that it asks for the believer's loving attention and complete willingness to follow the Lord. His successor, Pope Benedict XVI, revealed similar views about the shroud when he made a pilgrimage to pray before it in 2010. He stated that the linen cloth had, quote, wrapped the remains of a crucified man in full correspondence with what the Gospels tell us of Jesus. This statement was widely seen as confirming that the shroud was the actual burial cloth of Jesus. Pope Francis also made a pilgrimage to the shroud in 2015. After praying, he reached out to touch it with reverence, all things you wouldn't expect from a pope who considered the shroud to be a fake. Others who have shown they believe the shroud is authentic include prominent American Bishop Robert Barron, who went as far as describing the shroud as the relic that Peter and John saw in the tomb. Prominent priests who have also indicated they believe the shroud is genuine include Father Mike Schmidt, a popular communicator with young people. Another is Father Andrew Dalton, who is speaking at this conference. So, if you're convinced the shroud is real, be assured you are in good company. Unfortunately, some people still try to brush aside the evidence. You hear statements like, physics will work it out one day. But the study of the shroud is not just about physics, or chemistry, or biology, or archaeology, or history, All of these disciplines and others have confirmed the Shroud's authenticity. So what can you do to promote the Shroud? First, get excited. If you really understand even some of the evidence, you should be excited. Also, be convinced the Shroud can change lives. Spread the word. Help others understand there is something extraordinary here, something that can't be brushed aside, something tangible that helps to bring the gospel to life. Of course, some people will never agree. As Jesus told his disciples, move on. As with all evangelization, you can't expect to succeed with everyone. One piece of advice, it is important to reach out to young people. After talks I've had with young people, many have asked, why didn't we know about this? Why didn't anyone tell us? And remember, the message of the Shroud is not just about scientific evidence. In particular, many Shroud researchers have been moved by the profound peace communicated by the face on the cloth. As Pierre Barbet put it, unlike anything else in this world, the face on the Shroud shows us serene and astounding and adorable majesty. This serene majesty we see on the battered face of the man on the Shroud is an essential part of its message, the Christian message, about selfless love that leads ultimately to peace and joy. Any conversion to Christianity would necessarily have to involve an encounter with this message, and it is unlikely to be missed by anyone who contemplates the man on the Shroud and meditates on his awe-inspiring, deeply moving act of love. Unlike the scientific evidence, the spiritual message of the Shroud appeals to both the human intellect and to the human heart.